Welcome to the public consultation on the options that have been identified by a feasibility study for the future of the Clyde Museums. These options have been formulated over the last few months following detailed investigations by Origin consultants and their specialist team, in collaboration with Clyde Historical Museums and the Central Otago District Council. The buildings in the photograph you're looking at are the two main museum sites in Clyde, the Blythe Street Museum at the top and the Briar Herb Museum at the bottom. The locations of the two main museum sites are shown here. The Blythe Street Museum is located at the junction of Mattau Street and Blythe Street. It is a 1960s building with a couple of smaller buildings at the rear. It is open only for a few hours a week at certain times of the year. The Briar Herb Museum is a collection of buildings situated at the corner of Fraser Street and Fash Street, close to the historic railway station. It is currently closed due to the buildings being in poor condition. Also shown in the photograph is the location of the museum room in the historic railway station building. It is important to note that this room is not affected by the options described in a moment. It will continue to be a display space in the future. It is also important to note that the options do not affect the historic town centre of Clyde or the Clyde Heritage Precinct. This slide shows some of the buildings and features of the Blythe Street Museum. The front of the museum is shown in the bottom left corner, and the council chamber room inside the main building is shown above in the top left corner. On the right at the top is the police lockup, which dates from 1938 and which has in recent years been relocated to the rear of the museum for use as a store. This is an important local heritage building. Below this is the basic storage block, the old ablutions block, and finally there are some interior views of the museum rooms to remind you of what it is like. Here is the layout of the buildings at the Briar Herb Museum. Buildings A, C and D are all reasonably modern buildings, although all have been built of materials like mud brick to make them look and feel old. These buildings are largely those that are called the at-risk buildings later in this presentation. Building B is the historic goods shed that used to be alongside the Clyde railway station but was relocated some years ago. It has heritage value as part of the railway station complex. Below are front and rear photographs of the Briar Herb factory building, which have been identified as important local heritage buildings for the town during the course of the museum's feasibility study. On the left is the dairy, another relatively modern building constructed of mostly traditional materials, and below this is Holden Cottage. The cottage is outside the scope of the feasibility study and options. In a moment, you will have the opportunity to walk about and look at the posters that represent the 6 options that have been identified. We would like you to discuss your thoughts on each option with the person manning that poster and leave your thoughts on a post-it note stuck to the poster board. Each option has much more to it than we can tell you about in this slide presentation, and the person at the poster will be able to give you more details and answer your questions. Finally, we would like you to vote for your preferred option by taking just one marble from the jar in front of you and putting it in the jar next to the poster for the option you like best. But first, before you start, a quick word about some of the symbols you'll see on the posters. These are just general indicators. The cost dollar symbol and time clock symbol are simple to understand. One symbol means less cost or time, and 3 symbols means more cost or time. The number of exclamation marks gives an indication of the risk involved in the options. The heritage symbol indicates how well the option retains the heritage values of the sites, and the collection symbol gives an idea of what is likely to happen to the museum collections. For example, some options will involve reducing the size of the collections. This is a complex issue and might seem dramatic, but it is fair to say that not all parts of the collections are of the same value. The same applies to the value of the heritage buildings at the sites. A green traffic light indicates a building is selected and remains open. An amber traffic light indicates lots of alterations or changes. And a red traffic light indicates a building would be closed. Now, on to the options. Option 1 would involve the closure of both the Blythe Street and Briar Herb Museum sites, meaning that in the future, Clyde will no longer have a working museum. The buildings and their sites would be disposed of, and the most valuable parts of the collections dispersed to other museums or sold. The static museum room at the railway station would remain, and the town centre and heritage precinct would be unaffected. The future for the heritage buildings on the sites would depend on the future uses of the sites and whether a viable adaptive reuse could be found for them. The police lockup presently behind the Blythe Street Museum and Goods Shed at the Briarherb site could be relocated to another site in the town, such as alongside the railway station. This is option 2, and is referred to as the do nothing or the status quo option. The Briarherb site would remain closed, just as it is at the moment, and the Blythe Street site would continue as the town's museum with limited opening hours. There would be no significant financial or community investment in the sites, but there would still need to be money spent on both. Maintenance will be needed at both sites, and the Briarherb Museum buildings will need to be fenced off and probably demolished in the future. There will also come a point in the future when upgrading works are needed at Blythe Street. The heritage buildings and collections at the site would remain, but would increasingly be at risk due to lack of resources at each of the sites. Option 3 is the do-all option. Clyde would continue to have 2 museums into the future, and both sites would be extensively redeveloped to upgrade the buildings and redisplay the revitalised collections. Upgrading would involve earthquake strengthening of all at-risk buildings, new building services such as heating, ventilation and fire alarms, and other improvement works to make the buildings fit for purpose. As you can imagine, the cost of doing this will be very expensive, and all the improvement works will take some time. This would also place significant pressure on volunteers to operate both museums. While there will be a great benefit to the heritage buildings on the sites and the collections, this option will recreate the pre-2015 status of the museums, with both being open, small visitor numbers, but in much better physical condition. The risk here is a very large financial one, with a lot of money spent on the buildings, but no great increase in visitor numbers or their use to the community. In option 4, the focus for museum redevelopment is on the Blythe Street site, with the buildings being upgraded and improved. The risk here is the redeveloped museum will remain on the edge of the visitor centre of town and on a small site with little scope for future expansion or development. The Briarherb Museum site would be redundant and would be disposed of or redeveloped for another use. Exactly what this would involve is impossible to say at this point in time, but it's likely the at-risk buildings would be demolished to make way for development, with the historic goods shed relocated to the railway station. And the aim would be to find an adaptive reuse for the Briarherb factory buildings and their part of the site. In the future, these buildings might be used for a new commercial activity, and the site could become a community garden or other green space. Option 5 is the reverse of the last option. The Blythe Street site would be disposed of for a new commercial use or redevelopment, and the historic police lockup would be relocated to another site in the town. The focus for museum redevelopment would be on the Briarherb Museum site. Creating a new fit-for-purpose museum on this site would almost certainly involve demolition of the at-risk buildings and the creation of a new purpose-built facility here, with the historic goods shed being relocated to the railway station. The new building would incorporate other uses as well as the Clyde Museum. These could include a library, a community facility for arts use, and a museum research and archive facility. This site potentially has more scope for expansion and development than the Blythe Street one. As in the previous option, the aim would be to find an adaptive reuse for the Briarherb factory buildings and their part of the site. These buildings might be used for a new commercial activity. Option 6 is the wildcard option. It raises the question of whether neither the Blythe Street or Briarherb sites should house the town's museum in the future, but instead a new site within the town should be found. No new site has been identified, but it could be in the town centre in the most visitor-focused area. Both of the existing museum sites would then be disposed of and the historic police lockup and goods shed relocated to, say, the railway station. But there might be difficulties in finding a new site, and putting the museum in the town centre would increase the traffic and parking issues that already exist there. These are our 6 options in brief. As we said earlier, there is more to each than can be quickly described in a short presentation. Please ask the person at each poster to explain more to you and leave your comments so that your views can be taken into account. Finally, don't forget to take a marble, vote for your preferred choice by putting it in the jar next to the poster of the option you consider to be the best. Thank you for your help choosing the best future for our Clyde Museums.